Order, order. If members could leave the hall quietly to enable the next debate to start. I call Pauline Latham.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, the first time, I believe. It's interesting that this debate is following on from the one about the First World War, and I know that the Minister came in just after what was being said, some of the things that were said about how we remember our past and how it is very important for our future. So the purpose of this debate today is to call on the United Kingdom government to officially recognise the dreadful and tragic part of Ukraine's history as genocide. I have met with the Ukrainian community in Derby, where they still feel distressed that we've never recognised the Ukrainian Holodomor as genocide, even though other countries, including some from the Commonwealth, do. Madam Chairman, the Ukrainian Holodomor refers most specifically to the brutal artificial famine imposed on the Ukrainian people in 1932 and 3 by Stalin's regime. In its broadest sense, the Holodomor refers to the Ukrainian genocide that began in 1929 with the massive waves of deadly deportations of Ukraine's prospering farmers, as well as the deportation and execution of Ukraine's religious, academic and cultural leaders, culminating in the devastating forced famine that killed millions of innocent men, women and children. In 1932-33, a man-made famine raged through Ukraine and Kuban, resulting in the deaths of between 7 to 12 million people, mainly Ukrainians, instigated by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Of course, there are deniers of the Holodomor in the same way that those who deny the existence of the Holocaust. In fact, there's a division of opinion within Ukraine on the number that died, from 2 to 3 million up to 12 million. But they do agree that it was a man-made famine directed at Ukrainians in Ukraine and Kuban, and it meets the criteria of the definition of genocide as defined by the 1948 UN Convention. It's hardly surprising there's some confusion on the Holodomor, since it is poorly documented, the records were manipulated, and those conducting the census were executed. The main goal of this artificial famine was to break the spirit of the Ukrainian farmers and to force them into collectivism, and was used as an effective tool to break the resistance of Ukrainian culture. Moscow perceived this to be a threat to Russo-centric Soviet rule and therefore acted to crush the cultural resistance in a most brutal and sadistic manner. The resulting goal of this artificial famine was to ethnically cleanse Ukrainians from vast areas. In 1932, Stalin increased the basic grain procurement quota for Ukraine by 44%. They knew that this extraordinarily high quota would result in a grain shortage, therefore resulting in the inability of Ukrainian peasants to feed themselves. Such a goal would not have been achievable even if the communists had not already ruined the nation's productivity by eliminating the best farmers. That year, not a single village was able to meet the impossible quota, which far exceeded Ukraine's best output in previous years. Soviet law was quite clear that no grain could be given to feed the peasants until the quota was met. Stalin then issued one of the cruelest orders of his career. If quotas were not met, all grain was to be confiscated. As one Soviet author much later wrote, all the grain, without exception, was requisitioned for the fulfilment of the plan, including that set aside for sowing, fodder, and even that previously issued to the kolkhozniki, the collectivized peasants, as payment for their work. The authorization included seizure of all food from all households. Any home that did not turn over all of its grain was accused of hoarding state property. Communist Party officials, with the aid of military troops, USSR government secret police and the USSR Law Enforcement Agency, were used to move against peasants who may be hiding grain from the Soviet government. Of course, to try and avoid starvation, nearly every family did attempt to conceal food, as you would expect. You've got children who are dying, you would not want to let them die, never mind yourself. But experience soon made those brigades proficient at detecting even the cleverest hiding places. The result was mass starvation that took millions of lives during the terrible winter of 32-33. Food was nearly impossible to find anywhere. Unable to get food, many would eat whatever could pass for it: weeds, leaves, tree bark, insects, and some were lucky enough to be able to live on small woodland animals. In August 1932, the Communist Party of the USSR passed a law mandating the death penalty for theft of social property. Watchtowers were built, manned by trigger-happy young communists. Thousands of peasants were shot for attempting to take a handful of grain or a few beets from the kolkhozes to feed their starving families. To put this into perspective, at the height of the genocide, Ukrainians were dying at a rate of 25,000 per day, and nearly 1 in 4 rural Ukrainians perished as a direct result. At the same time, the Soviet Union dumped 1.7 million tonnes of grain on Western markets. Nearly a fifth of a tonne of grain was exported for each person who died of starvation, and over 3 million children born between 1932 and 33 died of starvation. Madam Chairman, many peasants attempted to reach Ukraine's cities like Kiev, where factory workers were still allowed a little pay and food. However, in December 1932, the communists introduced the internal passport. This made it impossible for a villager to get a city job without the party's permission, which was almost universally denied. The internal passport system was implemented to restrict movements of Ukrainian peasants so they could not travel in search of food. Ukrainian grain was collected and stored in grain elevators that were guarded by military units and secret police units, while Ukrainians were starving to death in the immediate area. This Moscow-instigated action was a deliberate act of genocide against the Ukrainian peasants. Other peasants hoped to get to Poland, Romania, or even Russia, where there was no famine, but emigration was strictly forbidden. Ukrainian train stations were swamped with the starving who hoped to sneak aboard a train or beg in a hope that a passenger from a passing train might throw them a bread crust. They were repelled by guards who found themselves faced with the problem of removing countless corpses of the starving who littered these stations. Madam Chairman, as I have said, at the famine's height, 25,000 people per day were dying. As the winter of 32-33 wore on, Ukraine became a panorama of horror. The roadsides were filled with corpses of those who died seeking food. The bodies, many of which snow concealed until the spring thaw, were unceremoniously dumped into mass graves by the communists. Many others died of starvation in their own homes. Some chose to end the process by suicide, commonly by hanging, if, of course, they had the strength to do it. One American correspondent reported, the bodies of some were reduced to skeletons, with their skin hanging greyish-yellow and loose over their bones. Their faces looked like rubber masks with large, bulging, immobile eyes. Their necks seemed to have shrunk into their shoulders. The look in their eyes was glassy, heralding their approaching death. Madam Chairman, the worst paradox is that much of the confiscated grain was exported to the West. Large portions were simply dumped into the sea by the Soviets or allowed to rot. For example, a huge supply of grain lay decaying under guard at a station in Poltava province. Passing it in a train, an American correspondent saw huge pyramids of grain piled high and smoking from internal combustion. In the Lubotino region, thousands of tons of confiscated potatoes were allowed to rot, surrounded by barbed wire. The news of this act of brutality managed to get out to the West, including Germany from various observations from their consulate in Kharkiv, Britain by various journalists, including Gareth Jones, and I've just heard that there's a book being published about him imminently, and Malcolm Muggeridge, who never forgot what he saw. In Canada, the Ukrainian community explained what was happening, and the United States. The genocide continued for several years with the further destruction of Ukraine's political leadership, the resettlement of Ukraine's depopulated areas with other ethnic groups, and the blatant public denial of famine and the prosecution of those who dared to speak of it publicly. Madam Chairman, it was the official policy of the Soviet Union to deny the existence of a famine and therefore to refuse any outside assistance. Anyone claiming there was in fact a famine was accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Inside the Soviet Union, a person could be arrested for even using the word famine or hunger or starvation in a sentence. The Holodomor was kept out of official history until 1991, when Ukraine, a country of 47 million people, finally won its independence. As James Perloff once wrote, the Holodomor stands as a permanent warning of what happens when unlimited state power destroys God-given rights. A cursory review of America's Bill of Rights demonstrates that virtually every right mentioned was trampled on by Stalin in Ukraine. Yet although the dictator used every means to eradicate the people's will, the national spirit lived on unbreakably until Ukraine gained its independence.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this important debate. There's a vibrant Ukrainian community in Huddersfield and Colne Valley, and I celebrated Christmas with them in January earlier this year. Now, 4 years ago, following an exhibition on the Holodomor in the Kalnya Community Centre in Huddersfield, Kirklees Council actually voted, my local council, to accept that the Holodomor was a genocide. Would my honourable friend agree that it's now time for the United Kingdom to formally recognise that these horrific events were in fact a genocide?
Yes, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for intervening with that point. That is exactly what I hope that the Minister is going to be able to say in his response to this debate, because these are innocent people who've come to this country, are contributing to the society in Britain in a very positive way, and they deserve the recognition of their horrific past. Madam Chairman, Ukraine's government is now asking the United Nations to recognise the disaster as an act of genocide. In recent years, the then Ukrainian President, Viktor Yushchenko, had ordered the release of old KGB records on the famine. With this information, it has become very apparent that this famine was a deliberate act of genocide, a method to ethnically cleanse Ukrainians from the territories of Ukraine and parts of Russia. At first, only several thousand documents were released. Recently, another batch of 25,000 documents is in the process of being declassified. As more and more documents are released, this event in Ukrainian history has taken on a very ominous tone. Madam Chairman, on November the 28th, 2006, the Parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, passed a law defining the Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide. Since then, many nations have recognised that the Holodomor was an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Estonia, Ecuador, Georgia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, Poland and the United States. Other countries have made a Holodomor declaration, and they include Argentina, Czech Republic, Chile, Slovak Republic, Spain, Balearic Islands and the Vatican. Russia is still in complete denial that this event occurred and that it was a deliberate act. In fact, in Russia it was made illegal to commemorate this event. The success of using food as a weapon to control, punish and eliminate a people was first used by the Soviet communists. Since then, this has become a standard tool in the arsenal of communist regimes to control, punish and eliminate people, and has been used by such regimes such as China, North Korea, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Zimbabwe and others. Madam Speaker, I'm asking the Minister present to seriously investigate this issue of the Ukrainian Holodomor, which I've raised here today. It is time for the UK to follow the examples of the countries I've mentioned, many from the Commonwealth, and to set the history record straight once and for all. We have a large Ukrainian community in this country, and I believe we owe it to them to recognise the extermination of millions of their ancestors through no fault of their own, who suffered a horrific time which can only be defined as genocide. This community will be extremely grateful to the government if it was to change its mind to redefine the Holodomor as the genocide it feels like to so many people. This is not about politics, reparations or blame, but about basic human morality and respect for life. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
And I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Mid Derbyshire, for her success in securing this debate, and also for the way in which she made her case with commitment, with eloquence and passion, which I think did justice to the gravity of the appalling events that we are debating this morning. I mean, to say that the famine that culminated in 1932 and 1933 was a terrible tragedy is to underestimate the sheer brutality and inhumanity of what took place, and I think my honourable friend will be the first to agree that the particular anecdotes and illustrations on which she drew in her speech can give us but the briefest glimpse of an horrific picture that was the daily experience of suffering amongst people in Ukraine during that time. I mean, the numbers of people who were involved and who suffers were staggering. I mean, across vast swathes of what was then the Soviet Union, notably in Ukraine, but also as far west as Moldova and eastwards into Kazakhstan, millions of people starved to death because of the policies of their own government. And I think it's a cause for some heart-searching in the Western world that for decades this tragedy was often overlooked or ignored. Worse, it was in some quarters denied even amongst some who had pretensions to serious scholarship. Of course, countless people inside and outside Ukraine have fought to keep alive the memory of those who died in this atrocity and to raise awareness of the Holodomor. But probably in the West, it was pioneering historians of their time, like Robert Conquest, who first drew attention to what had happened. And I remember still, as a schoolboy, reading the first volume of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago and finding there his account of the famine set in its broader context of policies of persecution, policies sometimes of slaughter, that were directed by Lenin and Stalin against the peoples over whom they ruled. What the efforts of those historians, but the efforts too of those many people inside and outside Ukraine have achieved, is that people across the world now continue to remember those who were lost and reflect today on the warning from history that the famine clearly provides. There's no question, in the government's view, that the famine took place as a result of Stalin and the actions of his government. It was a man-made tragedy. It is clear, too, that it is within modern Ukraine where the terrible consequences of those actions were most heavily borne. Whether Ukraine was specifically targeted, whether this was a campaign directed by Stalin against any manifestation of Ukrainian nationhood is something certainly widely believed, although not without controversy inside Ukraine. But it's also true that other parts of the then Soviet Union were gravely affected by the famine. In Kazakhstan, for example, the death toll as a proportion of the local population was higher than in Ukraine. And areas of rural Russia, too, were affected, and innocent people died there, too. But what is also clear is that the Soviet regime felt deep hostility to any manifestation of Ukrainian nationalism, and it must have known that policies targeting the agricultural regions of the Soviet Union would have a disproportionate effect on Ukraine. The fact that during the famine, Stalin closed the eastern border of Ukraine to stop starving peasants from entering Russia in search of food is perhaps one of the strongest indications that his policy was at least in part motivated by a hostility to Ukraine as a nation with an identity, tradition and culture of its own. I think no reasonable man or woman today would deny the horror, the atrocity that was the Holodomor. Now, my honourable friend asks whether the government will recognise the Holodomor formally as a genocide, and given the history of the Holodomor, I well understand the depth and strength of feeling in favour of doing that, and why some parliaments around the world have already done so. Now, as the House knows, there is still a debate amongst historians and others about the question of recognition of the Holodomor as genocide. And genocide, of course, has a defined status in international law following the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. The Holodomor predated the establishment of the concept of genocide in international law, and it was not drafted to apply retrospectively. And it is the policy of the government that the recognition of genocides should be a matter for judicial decision, bearing in mind the terms of the UN Convention and the consequences for individuals and governments that can follow from the designation of their actions as genocide, and that it should be for judges rather than governments or non-judicial bodies to make such a designation of genocide. We believe that recognition decisions should be based on a credible judicial process, and that the courts are best placed to make a judgment on what are essentially criminal matters. The British government has not proactively designated any atrocities as genocide. Those that we have recognised, the Holocaust, the 1994 killings in Rwanda and the 1995 massacre at Srebrenica, were all cases in which judicial bodies had judged the outrages to be genocide in line with the definitions set out in international law. What we have done, and what we will continue to do, is to make clear our abiding horror at what happened in Ukraine in the 1930s. Every year, the Ukrainian government hosts a formal ceremony of commemoration in Kiev. They invite foreign ambassadors, and normally our ambassador represents the United Kingdom at that event. In 2008, to mark the 75th anniversary of the Holodomor, Their Royal Highnesses the Duke of York and Princess Eugenie travelled to Kiev, took part in the ceremony and laid wreaths at the Kiev Memorial to the victims of the Holodomor. And I give my honourable friend and the House the undertaking that we will not forget or overlook what happened. It is important for all of us that governments and peoples throughout Europe continue to learn the lessons of what happened in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe in those years, in order to make sure that no one is tempted again towards policies that could have such an appalling effect upon innocent men, women and children. And we will look for other opportunities to demonstrate our solidarity with the people of Ukraine and to mark with them the opportunity to mourn those who suffered and lost their lives during the Holodomor, and to recall the importance of remembrance of that atrocity for the new generations going to adulthood today. Nothing should diminish the horror, the magnitude of the events in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Man-made policies, brutal dictatorship, a pitiless ideology led to the deaths of many millions of innocent people. That is something that the world cannot and should not ever forget.